This video is a brief introduction to how I think about all the various ideas that people connect to the word sex. Because sometimes people are referring to gender, sometimes to an act, sometimes to desire, and sometimes to relationships. None of these are the same thing, and it's important for us to remember that these can combine in complex ways in any human individual. So to try to clarify this, I'm going to give you a very brief idea of what I mean by each of these. This is going to be necessarily brief. If you have additional questions, please feel free to let me know. When I think about these ideas, I tend to think about them across the lifetime of a person, because while we're constantly surrounded by socialization messages about sex, gender, and relationships, not all of these are our focus at every stage of our life. They can be highlighted at any time, depending on our social context, but they tend to develop over time, and how this happens is in fact a complex and detailed story in the life of each person living in each culture, and so on. Before we begin, I want to explain what you'll see on each of these slides. Rather than simply defining terms, many of which you'll already know, I find it useful to think of each of these pieces of development in terms of both the norms and expectations that are so prevalent in our world, and also the research or reality of what we know about these ideas in psychological and other sciences. So on each slide here, you'll see a box listing some common cultural or societal norms held about these areas, as well as some of what we know to be true, which is often in stark contrast to these assumptions. Please remember that norms will always vary, as no two cultures or families are identical. My point here is to encourage us to use this model of thinking and consider what norms we may have absorbed about ideas, and then compare that to what we learn from research and reflection. How might thinking outside the box about these assumptions help us not only to know more, but also to be more inclusive of more people? I always begin with biology, which is one definition of the word sex. And the reason I begin with biology is that this is what we're born with. Biology is all that we have at birth. It informs many pieces of who we are in infancy, like temperament, sleep, and food needs. And it is also far less simple than we have all been led to believe. Our biology involves the combination of miles of genetic coding and the development of millions of synapses into brain circuits. These complex configurations determine everything from how our internal organs develop to reflexes and temperament. Without getting tangentially into a side lecture on how biological sexual development occurs, it's important to note that this involves far more than just two chromosomes. We know that there are a multitude of possibilities during biological sexual development due to the numerous processes in action at this time. Structural development, release of various hormones in utero, and the impact of this on the developing brain. As a result, primary sex characteristics do appear to be bimodally distributed, with up to 2% of the human population falling at the center of that distribution. These intersex experiences, often dismissed as negligible or non-existent, are in fact as common as being born a twin or having red hair, and we certainly would not dismiss those physical traits as non-existent. But it's also important to note that these rates rely on observations of external and internal physical human structures, and they don't address the overlap in neurobiology that is supported by research evidence, but not routinely examined due to the cost and complexity of imaging the human brain. Okay, so a child is born, they have their biology, but predictably everyone in their life wants to know, quote, what is it, right? Invariably, people want to ask whether prospective parents know the sex of their fetus. And when they know and share this, it often shifts patterns in the behavior of the people around them, patterns of purchasing gifts, books, clothing, etc., before the fetus is even born. This pattern of altering our behavior towards a child because of something we know about their genitalia is called gendering, and it is a powerful way in which gender roles and rules are communicated in cultures long before children are even thinking about their gender. Gender socialization of this type tends to be specific to the culture or subculture in which it exists, but it is also heavily influenced by the majority culture around it, particularly in messages about what is safe in terms of gender expression. This is an important reminder because we tend to assume that the way a person presents, what gender norms their appearance conforms to, represents their inner experience. However, this is often not true, particularly given how violations of these norms tend to be policed from early childhood. While this is not true in all places and times, the most common norm around gender is the assumption that there are only two genders and that they automatically match the biological sex of the individual. Masculine for people with a penis, feminine for people with a vulva. And that this will determine the interests, personality, and behavior of the person in question. Ultimately, we know that the interests, personality, and behavior of a person are far more strongly influenced by their brain and the experiences of their lives, which includes the gender socialization they are exposed to, but also a million other experiences that they will have. And that the range of experiences and desires that people will have, particularly around gender identity and expression, is as numerous as the individuals themselves. Many people do not experience discomfort between their assigned gender and their experience and desire. This is generally referred to as a cisgender experience. For others, however, there may be varying levels of tension between the social rules and expectations associated with their assigned gender and their personal sense of identity. The umbrella term for this experience is transgender or gender nonconforming. However, individuals may use any of innumerable identities or descriptors to better capture their personal experience. We'll return to this topic later, but be thinking about how this kind of pressure and the power of social norms might show up in your world and in the world around you. So, assuming that what I've said has made sense so far, this next one should hopefully line up. Sexual identity, also referred to as sexual orientation at times, is generally used to denote who a person is attracted to. However, it's important that we think expansively about this too. Historically, this has been conceptualized in very dichotomous ways and exclusively focused on a person's behavior. I use the term sexual identity exclusively because identity is personal. It is about our own conception and understanding of ourselves and is not behavior dependent. Historically, as I've noted, assumptions have been made that sexual dimorphism was real and that all people were cisgender. The corollary assumption here was that all people were attracted to someone of the opposite gender. If, as we now know, sex and gender are more complicated, it stands to reason that sexual identity is going to have to be also. Ultimately, we know that neither sex nor gender are what attracts us to partners, sexual or otherwise, but just a part of the whole person. Sexual identity, then, is our label for what we know about each individual's trend in human attraction. And because we grow and change as people over time, it is necessarily fluid and can change over the course of a lifetime. It is also important to understand that despite cultural assumptions, a person's sexual identity does not determine their sexual behavior. People make choices. So a person who identifies as pansexual, but who is, for example, in a relationship that to an outside observer appears heterosexual, that person is still pansexual. Also, don't assume you know the gender of either person in the relationship from the outside. This is also a good example of why the word queer is increasingly popular in communicating that social norms are not driving relationship behavior or other decisions for people. I want to pause for a moment and share with you a piece of history that may help frame this exploration of sexual identity, and which also may help us to understand that the psychological community also continues to grow in our understanding of human variation. Keep an eye out for this theme, as it will show up again later. As you may know, the original DSM was published in 1952, and in early versions, quote, homosexuality was a diagnosable mental illness. It was activism, first on the part of community groups, which was then taken up by professionals, that moved the American Psychiatric Association towards altering this. One of the many things that was remarkable about this was the risk these individuals took. In the picture on this slide, you see someone testifying at the 1972 American Psychiatric Association conference on a panel about the campaign to declassify. He was introduced to the convention as Dr. Henry Anonymous and appeared wearing a mask that covered his entire head and being relayed through an audio device that disguised his voice. He has, since that time, been identified as Dr. John Fryer, and he is a hero in the field. Thanks to the work he did along with others who would only be identified later, the campaign was successful to a point. In the 1973 publication of the DSM-3, homosexuality was not included as a named diagnosis. However, a category was included to capture experiences of individuals who were distressed about being gay, specifying that being gay was not the disorder, but that specific distress or impairment deserved to be treated. An official statement from the APA later was clear that, quote, homosexuality per se implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social or vocational capabilities, end quote. However, continuing to include coded diagnostic language, which would not be fully removed from subsequent editions until the 2013 publication of DSM-5, shows just how powerful the social norms around heterosexuality were and are, that they can engender distress and dysfunction to the point of clinical diagnosis in cases in which individuals are authentically identifying and living their lives. This is also an important recognition of how language and diagnoses evolve, often slowly and cautiously, something that we will see again. I hope that, as we talk about the messages and implications from parents, families, peers, and even the psychological community, you're seeing the impact of messages about how and with whom we should have relationships. But I also want to stop and ask you to consider for a moment, what messages do you remember getting about sexual and relational norms? I think that it is important that we think about this in terms of how early it begins, with messages everywhere from cartoons to romantic movies, but also in what it does and does not teach us. How often did these examples show us how to have a relationship after happily ever after? What I think they do communicate to us is that what we are expected to do by the adults in our lives, which, when we're children, is really what we most want to live up to. The last one on the right-hand side of this slide, I think in particular, is a great example of all of these combined: gender, sex, and relationship socialization. Before this child is really old enough to know what they like or want, the implication is that they should identify with a particular gender, be looking for a different gender in a partner, and that they should want a relationship. Think back to the ideas we talked about. People are so quick to say, oh, that's just normal because it's all we've known. But for those who are pushed into a normal that is not a good fit for them, it is intensely uncomfortable and leads to distress and dysfunction. There's one other idea I want you to consider as we talk about messages that we get from early in our lives. What does it mean to, quote, have sex? I'm guessing that each of us had some very specific idea built up in our minds about that from an early age. For some people, they have a specific activity associated with that idea. Others assume that it only takes place in one setting, like a bedroom. I joke that because I grew up on 80s movies, I always assumed sex was when the background soundtrack got louder and the cameras panned to the fireplace. Whatever those assumptions are, we tend to become culturally encapsulated in them, and they then form a bias against which we can tend to judge new ideas and experiences. So often we will hear people debate about whether a particular activity does or does not count as sex. There's often a bias or assumption that only sex that involves contact between a penis and a vulva is sex, with exceptions made for other encounters involving a penis and other body parts. But have you noticed that those times people tend to specify, quote, anal sex, quote, oral sex, etc.? We see the underlying bias again. And this is not really a useful definition. It is too narrow. It excludes whole populations, and possibly more important, it discounts whole realms of behavior that have the potential to significantly enrich people's lives. It is also cis and heterosexist and significantly ableist. For all these reasons, I would encourage you to adopt a more expansive definition of what it means to have sex. Interestingly, most dictionary definitions have done so. What we're really talking about here is any activities performed with consent for the purpose of sexual pleasure. This is a great definition because it centers consent and focuses on the goal of the activity, not what form it has to take. It also reminds us that assault, as well as any activity that takes place under coercion or without consent, is by definition not sex. I want to move from that point into talking about the kinds of sex that people do have. It's so important for us to remember that who people desire and what activities they engage in are not the same thing, and that how they interact is often a result of internal and external pressures. I hope that this will make sense to you given all that we've talked about here already, but this is staggeringly complex. On the one hand, when people talk about sex and sexual identity, they are often very focused on who people are interested having sex or a relationship with. But there's a whole other realm of understanding sex. What kind of sex do people want? As I just mentioned, sex involves any activities that have the goal of sexual pleasure, so this list could be endless. Stop for a moment and consider, what comes to mind for you when you think about the varieties of sexual behavior that people engage in? Did you think of this one? Often people forget to think about masturbation, but it fits our definition, and it's a valid and important part of people's sex life. What about these? As I said, these are just some examples of the vast diversity of sexual behavior engaged in by human beings. It is important to note that sex may have a more or less important role, depending on the life of the person. Individuals who identify as asexual or demisexual may describe sex as less important to them than others. But again, individuals will differ more within groups than between groups. Ultimately, every person is different, and if we center the consent we talked about and communicate our desires to one another, we will have much better results than if we simply assume we all want the same thing. The last broad piece I want to address is that of relationships and what people want in this area, what I call relational identity. We know that humans are social creatures and that relationships are important to us as a species. However, what we want and need in this area will vary by individual also. This is true in all areas of our relationships: friends, family, acquaintances, and romantic relationships. The norm that tends to show up in this area is the assumption that all people want or should want to be in a permanent, monogamous relationship, and that continuing to attempt these, one after another, until we find one that fits, is both personally and socially desirable. This norm can also tend to become entangled with other social norms about who holds power and gender roles in relationships, as well as what form relationships have to follow as they progress. This is often referred to as getting on the relationship escalator of dating, engagement, marriage, kids, and so forth. In reality, not everyone wants or can have any or all of those things. Not every person wants to be in a romantic relationships or wants to be in the kind of romantic relationships that others expect for them. People may desire intimacy in their relationships in many formats, and this does not have to exist exclusively in the context of what has traditionally been termed romance. Access to traditional relationship structures like marriage may also be inaccessible for people for a variety of reasons, including marriage inequality, disability status, and so on. Also, please note that when I say intimacy here, I do not exclusively mean physical intimacy, though that may be part of the connection. I also mean emotional and any other kind of intimacy, which people may want without sexual intimacy. For this reason, we want to think about all of the various kinds of relationships and relationship agreements that people may have in their world. As we come to the summary of this discussion, I want to remind you that this has been an overview and that there is much to explore in each of these areas. However, even looking at this broad overview of sexual, gender, and relational diversity, the question arises, How does this fit into all the other complexities of an individual human? To answer this, I'm going to ask you to think about yourself and some of your many identities. Stop for a minute and think about your identity in terms of education, race, age, language, ability, any of the many identities you hold. Then ask yourself, how do the pieces of my sexual, gender, and relational identity fit into this? When I talk about identities, I always point out that sometimes these identities play really nicely together, but sometimes they get spiky and are in conflict. For some people, their sexual, gender, and relational identities are in conflict with other identities, but for others, they fit in really easily. Sometimes the expectations of another identity may not want to play nicely with the other. And all of these are always swimming in the soup of socialization, subject to external pressures from norms about who we are told to be around gender, sex, relationships, and a million other things too. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all these ideas, that's okay. My goal here is to get us thinking about this and to understand that there are no hard and fast answers, but rather something more like a choose-your-own-adventure book that spans the life of a person. In childhood, the important challenges might be learning how to have friendships, what kind of person we want to be, and trying to understand how other people work. In early adulthood, we often are asking those questions again, but with a relational lens that's considering partnership and sharing a life together in ways we would never have contemplated as children. We really are a spiral, ever returning to important questions, getting deeper and closer to new meaning with every pass.